From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us at the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, which is the reading and literacy promotion arm of the library. We're nearing our 40th anniversary. We were created in 1977 by the historian Daniel Borston when he was Librarian of Congress, and he wanted the Library of Congress to have a way to reach out to the general public to promote books and reading, and now literacy and libraries as well. And we are active in a number of events and programs, both nationally and here at the Library of Congress. We were at the beginning of the National Book Festival, which is in Washington now in September, and it started in 2001. And the Center for the Book, with its ongoing author program of noontime talks that you're attending, thank you, actually started in 1996, and it's called Books and Beyond. So we have a long history of author promotion and book promotion. This particular series focuses on new books by authors who have used the Library of Congress and other libraries in their work, and our purpose is to make certain that there's a public appreciation of the results of the research that's done in libraries around the country, and also to promote these particular books in a way that will be productive, we hope, not only for the audience, but for the author and for the whole enterprise of publishing. The way it works is follows. We will hear from our guest author. There will also be a brief period for questions and answers, and then a book signing at the end. Today's program is being filmed both by the Library of Congress for its own website and archive. We now have over 350 of these author programs in the archive of Books and Beyond, which are available on the Library of Congress's website. Not to mention website productions of many author programs at the National Book Festival. We just had our 15th anniversary, and we have something like many hundreds of authors who have been part of that book festival. Today's program also is being filmed by C-SPAN, which is wonderful in terms of being able to reach out nationally, and for this program to be part of the C-SPAN archive. We will have time for a brief question and answer period at the end, and we hope that you will have questions. I know that our author will have answers, and I want to remind you that by asking a question and being part of that, you are really giving us permission to perhaps be part of at least the Library of Congress program and website broadcast. Josh Kendall, our speaker today, is an award-winning journalist and now a critically acclaimed biographer who lives in Boston. He's published many articles in newspapers, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, USA Today, and Psychology Today, which I think when I saw that, I said, aha, that's where Josh gets some of those insights. He's showing these psychological insights that we will probably hear a little bit about in today's presentation. He's been writing books, at least I believe, since, Josh, I don't have this right. This was, The Man Who Made Lists was published in 2008. And his first book, well, first of all, Josh always takes a particular angle on his subjects, and I find it interesting, and I'm always interested in how he has not only chosen his subject, but what part of it that he's emphasizing. And I finally figured out that he has a, not too hard to figure out, a special place in his heart for obsessed people. And often they are book people. His first book, 2008, is titled The Man Who Made Lists: Love, Death, Madness, and the Creation of Roget's Thesaurus. His next book, 2 years later, it was called The Forgotten Founding Father: Noah Webster's Obsession and the Making of an American Culture. And finally, he got right to it with the third book, which is called America's Obsessives. And here he presents biographical profiles of 7 American icons, including Thomas Jefferson, Charles Lindbergh, and Melville Dewey, who was the founder of the Dewey Decimal System and himself quite a wonderful but absolutely obsessive personality. Now he has tackled and is publishing in this election year a book about another complicated topic. I held it up once. It's called First Dads: Parenting and Politics from George Washington to Barack Obama. And here he's had to make some careful selections that I'm sure he'll tell us about. But basically, it brings together the personal histories of our presidents from yet another new angle, their experience as fathers. And I'm very pleased to be able to present to you for his latest take on American obsessives and American presidents, Josh Kendall. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be here. I think this is the third talk I've done at the Library of Congress. I spoke about a couple of my, one of my word nerds, Noah Webster, the forgotten founding father, the author of Webster's Dictionary, and then I also spoke about the America's Obsessives a few years ago. When we learn about presidents, we tend to learn about them for the first time in grade school, and the presidents are almost godlike figures. We learn about Washington and Lincoln, and they're kind of statues. I mean, it's as if in childhood they're all on Mount Rushmore, and that's all we know. And then later in life, maybe as teenager or young adult or adult, we start reading some biographies, and we get a sense, they're not all they cracked up to be. Maybe maybe they're very flawed, and we tend to think of presidents in very idealized terms, or either idealize them or denigrate them. And what I'm trying to do is capture how complicated presidents are. They're many-sided, and I really want to talk about presidential character. And I think the way into that is through the family. What kind of father was George Washington? What kind of father was Abraham Lincoln? And I want to give readers a feel for what it was like to have dinner or spend a weekend with any of these presidents. And that will give you a sense of the man and the decision-making process. And James David Barber, a political scientist in the 70s, wrote a book about presidential character. And he said, the issues will change, but the character of the president will last. So when we think of presidents, we tend to think of policy. What was his foreign policy? What was his economic policy? But I think what I'm trying to focus on is how the president makes decisions. And we can learn a little bit about that through how the president decides how much time to spend with his children, whether to punish his children, whether to encourage his children. And so it's parenting and politics from George Washington to Barack Obama. Now, the information about the president's kids, there hasn't been much written on this topic. One reason is that the families have tended to hide this information. Families don't want people like me, biographers, snooping around to find out, what happened to the kids. Some of the letters of John Adams to one of his children who died young are missing, and so the families tend to guard against this information. And also, historians have often overlooked the family relationships. And for historians, this is all considered squishy stuff. Why would it matter whether what kind of dad Franklin Pierce was? And what I've learned is that it's not squishy stuff. For instance, in 2016, one of the reasons that Joe Biden is not challenging Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination is that he lost a child. And I wrote a piece for the New York Times when that happened in October, when he decided not to run. And going back to Franklin Pierce, I have a category, talk about grieving dads, dads who lost children. Franklin Pierce, in 1853, he was a dynamic person, and he was considered, he was elected in 1852. 2 months before he was about to take office. He takes a train from Andover with his third and only surviving son, Benny, who's 11 years old. That train crashes. Benny gets a hole in his head. Something falls on Benny's head. Pierce has to pick up Benny with a hole in his head. Benny dies, and Pierce has post-traumatic stress disorder. His brain is fried. A couple of weeks later, he writes Jefferson Davis, his secretary, who's going to become Secretary of State, I don't know how I can go on. And Pierce he's totally out of it for his administration. His wife literally goes psychotic and starts writing letters to her dead children. And the Civil War deepens under the Civil War hasn't started yet, but I'm saying the crisis between the states gets much worse. So he's not really there as president. And the same is true of Calvin Coolidge. In 1924, Calvin Coolidge is about to run for a term of his own. Remember, in 1933, when Calvin Coolidge dies, the New Yorker journalist Dorothy Parker says, "How could they tell? Because he's half asleep." Well, before 1924, Calvin Coolidge is a dynamo. He's proposing all kinds of things. In July of 1924, just as he's about to start his own campaign, his 16-year-old son drops dead after cutting his toe on the tennis court. It would be something that would be treated very easily today. His son, Calvin Jr., and that's when he starts sleeping 11 hours a day, and that's when he has 5 more years to serve in the White House. So I argue, and I go through it in quite a bit of detail in the chapter, that his depression may well have caused the Great Depression. So this isn't squishy stuff. This is about the lifeblood of American history. And just think about it. George Washington is our first president. One of the reasons why George Washington was elected president, obviously he was very competent and was a dynamic leader who brought the country together. But Washington had no biological children. And after we kicked the Brits out of our face, we didn't want to have another king. And Washington was a safe choice. And he writes this in a draft to his first inaugural. He says, "And you can trust me as your president that I'm not going to pass on the reins of power to my son." And again, this isn't squishy stuff, that fatherhood has a deep connection to the fabric of American history. And again, I think we're facing that issue. Initially, this election, it looked like it was going to be dynasty versus dynasty. So again, Americans hate dynasties, and maybe that was one of the reasons why Jeb Bush had difficulty. And this again goes back to the case of George Washington. All right, let me talk a little bit about my method. So this is a nonpartisan book. I'm taking the long view of history. This is an election year, and I don't want to encourage people to vote for one candidate or the other, but just think about the issues, think about character. So we've had 43 presidents. Grover Cleveland was president twice, and we've had 38 had biological kids, including one of them who lied about it, Warren Harding. So I have a chapter on presidents. I call them double-dealing dads, presidents with illegitimate kids. But the other 5 presidents all adopted kids. So we have a database like Washington adopted Martha's kids, surviving kids. So we have a database to analyze all the presidents as fathers. And I put the presidents in 6 buckets. Preoccupied is the most common. So as Jimmy Carter, Jack, his eldest son, said, "Dad was one track. You don't get to be president unless you're driven." So that's the most common category, is the preoccupied. These are people who are thinking about politics all the time. Lyndon Johnson once said, "Oh, I think about politics only 18 hours a day." I spoke to Lucy Johnson, and she said that her sister Linda used to read the congressional record so she could get some FaceTime with LBJ. LBJ could not say, "Hi, Linda, how was your day?" That would mean that that's not about politics. But if he and Linda could talk about the congressional record, then they could connect, and the girls picked that up. So that's the largest category, the preoccupied. Other categories are playful. Teddy Roosevelt is a famous example. Teddy Roosevelt would work in the afternoon, and then maybe at 3 o'clock he would take off and play tag in the attic with his son and his friends, who were called the White House Gang. Then I have the double-dealing dads with illegitimate children. Warren Harding, and a lot of the material on Harding is here at the Library of Congress, and there's now DNA evidence proving that the mistress who claimed that they had sex in the coat closet in the White House wasn't lying. The DNA evidence came out last year. And the story about Harding is that there was a book in 1928 by the mistress, and no one believed it at the time. But then in 1964, a Harding biographer stumbled on hundreds of love letters to another mistress, and that mistress is Carrie Phillips. So if he was carrying on with Carrie Phillips, then the Nan Britton, her story seemed much more believable. And actually, the Library of Congress has just released all of those Carrie Phillips letters in the last couple of years. So preoccupied, playful, double-dealing. Another category is tiger dads. You may have heard of Amy Chua's book about the tiger mom. Very tough dads. John Adams and John Quincy Adams fall into that category. And tiger dad can either make or break their kids. John Adams had John Quincy Adams, and he basically told John Quincy when he was a young man, either you're going to be president or you're going to be a failure. And John Quincy became president. But a couple of his other kids had got depression and didn't do so well. Other categories are the grief-stricken. I mentioned Pierce and Coolidge. And the last category are the sweet dads, the nurturing dads. Our current president, whatever one thinks about his politics, I think everyone acknowledges that he's a great, great dad. But there were actually some sweet ones going back to the 18th century. James Monroe was very sweet, and Obama is a first sort of modern dad. I mean, Obama, as I told a reporter from The Guardian the other day, is the first presidential dad, at least in my calculations, to do diapers. And we're probably going to see more of that. There are going to be more nurturing dads in the 21st century. But what's interesting is that there were still some in the 18th century. And some presidents are in more than one category. For instance, George Herbert Walker Bush was both a preoccupied dad. Jeb Bush once told a biographer, "At least he didn't put us in a kennel." George Bush was based in Houston, and he would fly back to Connecticut on business and leave Jeb and George W. Bush, back in Houston, and a lot. And Jeb said, "At least we weren't put in a kennel; we were put with other, friends of the family." But George Herbert Walker Bush, he was very, and the preoccupied dads, they love their kids, but they're just very, very ambitious, and they're just so. One of the subtypes is the absentee dad. But George Herbert Walker Bush also was a grieving father. He lost his daughter Robin, the second child. She was about 4 in the early 50s, and that so he falls into both categories. And that loss actually gave us a playful dad, because George W. Bush, his eldest son who became president, Barbara became very depressed after this horrific loss. Apparently that's when her hair became white. And George W. Bush became very playful with his mother in an effort to cheer her up. And he then was also very playful with his two daughters. And I talk a little bit about him as a playful pal. Right. And in each chapter, what I did is I took 3 stars. So there are 43 presidents. And I wanted to say something about each president. But for instance, the preoccupied dads, I talk about FDR, Lyndon Johnson, and Jimmy Carter. So I have 3 stars, and then I fold in a lot of other presidents, Richard Nixon or William Howard Taft. So there are 18 presidents I profile in depth, and for those 18 presidents, I did archival research either here or at the FDR Library, whatever I could find documents. And for those presidents, I also interviewed family members. I interviewed several of FDR's grandchildren. Some of them are as old as 90 now, and it was exciting just to talk to someone who was there, when 1933, when he was inaugurated. She was about 4 or 5, but that was just very exciting. And then for Jimmy Carter, I spoke with his son, Chip. So for the 20th century presidents, I tried to do interviews as much as possible. And then for 18th and 19th, or for 19th and early 20th century presidents, I relied on archives. And I try to say something about them all. So I even say something about Chester Arthur. No one remembers who Chester Arthur was, Garfield's vice president. And I found out that he was very playful with his son, and his son, Alan Arthur, became a playful polo player, in case you wanted to know that. Right, preoccupied is the largest category. So again, that's the way to become president. And FDR, LBJ, and Carter, and I'd estimate about 40% of presidents fit into this category: Van Buren, Taft, Nixon, Reagan. And then also, this election, I just wrote a piece for Parade magazine. This election is kind of a rejection of Obama. Obama's a nurturing dad who's a connector. And in this election, we're sort of going back to the preoccupied dads. Both Hillary Clinton's not a dad, preoccupied parent, but she was very ambitious, like her husband. And same with Donald Trump. I interviewed Donald Trump's one of his sons, and Eric. And Eric, when he was 10 years old, was working with his father at construction sites. And Jimmy Carter's children were working on the peanut farm at age 10. Were collecting peanuts and driving tractors. So the preoccupied fathers connect with their children through work. And Obama is very different. Obama, like Harry Truman, is very interested in sort of promoting his girls and their development, but the standard preoccupied dad or mom, in the case of Mrs. Clinton, is, and Chelsea, works for the foundation, and her connection, she's been campaigning since she was 2 years old. I mean, her connection to her parents is through work. And with FDR, and sometimes the president is the same with the country as with his children. John Adams gave us the Alien and Sedition Acts. He was kind of an authoritarian president, and he was an authoritarian dad. FDR was a father figure to his country. When he dies in 1945, most Americans felt as if they had lost a father. And he was a very inspiring leader who instilled hope. But with his own children, FDR, a different side came out, and his children literally held him up. The book starts in 1924 at the Democratic National Convention when FDR makes his comeback after polio, and his son James is holding him up because he can't walk. And FDR, with his children, the children are parentified, so with his own children, he treats his own children as if they were his parent. His own children are kind of raising him up so that he can raise the country up. And when James is young, he wants to meet, when one of the children is young, he wants to meet his father, and they had to make appointments in the White House. And the boy wants to, the adolescent is going to get married, and he wants to talk to FDR. And in the middle of the meeting, FDR shoves a document in his son's face and says, "What do you think about this?" And the boy rushes out of the Oval Office and tells Eleanor, "I'm never going to talk to him about anything serious again." And FDR, again, to his own children is a bit neglectful, but to the country, he's very empathic. And and Ronald Reagan was another great communicator who inspired the country with his infectious optimism, but he kind of alienated his own children, who he didn't really connect with. Now, Jimmy Carter, as I said, had, everyone forgets that most people who are around during the Carter administration forget that Jimmy Carter had these three sons, that's Chip, Jeff, and Jack. We all remember Amy because she was very photogenic and she was going to primary school. But Jimmy Carter had the three sons, and Jimmy Carter, at first, the sons work with him in the peanut farming, and they start working at 10. And then the three sons in the 70s, in the mid-70s, are all in their 20s. And they're all married. They all marry young. And they're his campaign staff. So again, his children, without his children, there would be no Jimmy Carter winning the Iowa caucuses, because he had a built-in staff of 6 when he was a nobody. And Jimmy Carter's on What's My Line, either in, I think it's late 74 or early 75, and they can't even guess who he is, the governor of Georgia. No one knows about him. But he's got this staff of 6, and his children, and he is very grateful. To his credit, he's very appreciative of how much his children helped him, just as FDR's children propped him up. All right, the Playful Pals, Grant, Teddy Roosevelt, and Wilson. And Wilson everyone knows about Teddy Roosevelt, but Wilson is an interesting case because we think of Wilson as this dour intellectual, which he was, but a whole different side of him came out with his 3 daughters. One of his middle daughter, Jessie, describes him as a curious mix of dignity and almost wild gaiety. He loved dancing with his daughters. When he was in the White House, he would do chicken fighting, which is a kind of pushing each other, dancing up and down the corridors. And his brother-in-law, who lived with him at the White House, Stockton Axon, once said, "What would the great American public think if they could see their austere president now?" So Wilson is a whole different ballgame inside the family than he was in public. So the 3 stars of that chapter are Grant, Teddy Roosevelt, and Wilson. And Grant was actually a very sensitive dad who loved playing with his kids. And again, he was a general, and in the South, when they think of Grant, they think of a violent killer. But he loved playing with his kids. And there's also the question of Grant and his alcoholism. And I found that Grant was a sensitive family man, and he drank when he couldn't be around his children. I found some very tender letters that he writes to his wife. He's lapsing into 21st century psychology, saying, "I'm so attached to my boys, I miss them." And that's when he starts drinking. So that gave me new insight into Grant's character. Now the double-dealing dads, the heart of the matter. My 3 stars of this chapter are John Tyler, Grover Cleveland, and Warren Harding. I talked a little bit about Harding. John Tyler, Tippecanoe and Tyler II, the election of 1840, that was the most fertile ticket. Harrison had about 10 children. Tyler had about 8 children with his first wife, and he marries a second wife in 1844, the last year of his presidency, and has another 7 children with her. But there are also oral histories, and the oral history suggests that both Harrison as well as Tyler had slave children. And Tyler, I went snooping around in Virginia. the oral history suggests that there's an account that Tyler bragged about having 52 slave children. That's hard to prove, but there were allegations that came out in the press in the 1840s about some of these slave children. And I looked, and the most striking allegations are that he sold a few of the slave children. So a double-dealing dad. And I argue that Tyler both betrayed these children and also betrayed the country. Because when the Civil War started, there were 5 ex-presidents, and only one of them sided with the Confederacy. That was Tyler. And when he dies in 1862, Lincoln refuses to acknowledge his death and considers him a traitor. So, as I said, sometimes the dad and the politician are of the same ilk, and that's my argument with Tyler. And then Thomas Jefferson, as a lot has been written about Thomas Jefferson as a double-dealing dad, and I don't go into him. And then LBJ may have had an illegitimate kid. There's some canceled checks from a woman who wrote a memoir about an illegitimate child. And LBJ definitely was a bit of a sex maniac. He once bragged to his staff and said, I had as many women by accident as JFK had by design. So the allegations are definitely believable. And again, what I do in the chapter is just present the evidence that there is. In some cases, it's kind of a slam dunk. Some cases, the evidence isn't much. But just the 3 that Tyler, Cleveland, and Harding, and in the case of Harding, there's DNA evidence, and Cleveland does admit that he fathered a child out of wedlock, and that was a big issue. Again, that was a big issue in the campaign of 1884. So again, this isn't just squishy stuff about, this was also, that election pivoted around an illegitimate child. Right, the grief-stricken, Pierce, my 3 stars are Pierce, McKinley, and Coolidge. Pierce I told you about. McKinley has 2 daughters in the 1870s. Both die by the age of 4, and his wife becomes chronically depressed. But again, it's not squishy stuff because it inspires McKinley to go into politics. And that's kind of his brand. His brand was this sensitive man who'd experienced this loss, who was very supportive of his wife. His wife suffers a stroke, and his wife is a semi-invalid for the rest of her life, and she's very depressed. And what people loved about McKinley when he's first elected is that he and his wife, that he is very sensitive to his wife and a caring family man. So out of this tragedy, it's kind of polio made FDR. Some of the biographers have said that tragedy helped FDR empathize and helped him grow as a politician. And the same can be said with McKinley and his losses. And another interesting example of a grieving dad, he's not a star in my chapter, but someone I talk about is JFK. You may have forgotten that JFK loses a son in 1963, a few months before he's assassinated. And that didn't so much have an effect on national policy, but it did affect his marriage. JFK was kind of carrying on with various women, as has been reported, and his relationship with his wife was kind of cold for most of their time in the White House. But in his last few months of his life, he and his wife really reconnected over this shared loss. So it did have an effect on the marriage, and JFK was really evolving when he was tragically killed. Okay, the tiger dads are Adams, John Adams, and John Quincy Adams was also a tiger dad. His son, when his son, one of his sons, he had 3 sons, and one of his sons is 45th out of 85th in his class at Harvard, and he says, don't bother coming home for Christmas vacation. And then he says, then when his son does better, he said, I'm not going to go to your Harvard graduation unless you're in the top 10. So he's always kind of changing the goalposts, to use a modern a metaphor. And another example of a tiger dad is Eisenhower. He's a military guy. Eisenhower had a son, John. We think of Eisenhower as kind of a doddering golfer. I mean, he was in his 60s, for most of his presidency, but he was doing hundreds of push-ups, well into his 50s, and was an amazing physical specimen. At Army, he tackled Jim Thorpe. He was like a linebacker, and his son John once said, "My father never hit me, but if he had, he would have killed me." And John said that he was born standing at his attention. I mean, his father would give him orders. And Eisenhower also had a bad temper, and that's one of the things about tiger dads. And Eisenhower used to bark at his aides a lot, and Eisenhower then used to tell him, "Well, my mother taught me how to control my temper," and then as soon as he left the room, one of the aides would say, "And she didn't do a very good job." All right, and now the nurturing dads. Rutherford B. Hayes, remember we have the Easter egg roll, which is the largest event in the White House every year. Well, that's the child, to use the prevailing metaphor of the day, that's the child of Rutherford B. Hayes. He was very sweet to his own children, and one day, in those days, the president could kind of walk around, go out Pennsylvania Avenue and take a walk. He's walking in the neighborhood, and a strange kid comes up to him, an urchin, and says, "Hey, can we roll our eggs on your lawn?" And he says, "Let me talk to my people, and I'll get back to you." And he says, "Sure." He was just a sweet dad, and he went for it. Harry Truman was also very sweet to his daughter, Margaret. Margaret describes herself as a total daddy's girl. And you may not remember that Bess Truman, she hated publicity and was very shy, and she was traumatized early in life. When she was 18 years old, back in Independence, her father blew his brains out in the house. And Truman was actually afraid of running, even being on FDR's ticket in 1944 because of the publicity, because suicide then was a very shameful thing. And Bess was just nervous and just kind of a lifelong struggle, kind of a private person. So Margaret just loved her daddy. And a cute story is that Margaret wanted to become a singer. In the 1940s, she graduates from George Washington, and Bess, who's kind of stern, says, "Oh, you can't become a singer. This is America in the 1940s. You've got to get married and have kids." And Harry says, No. If she wants to be a warbler, let her be a warbler. He's very supportive. And again, today Obama is going to do something like that. The nurturing dads are a little more commonplace, but that was rare for the time. One of the fascinating things I found about the nurturing dads was that the nurturing dads did not really have dads themselves. For instance, obviously Obama has a father, but he only spent about 2 months with his own father from Kenya. And Rutherford B. Hayes' father dies before he's born. So both of these men father as they were mothered. So people have said, well, Bill Clinton is the first black president. Well, I think in many ways Barack Obama is almost the first female president. He has a very feminine way of relating. He's very nurturing to his children, and he's nurturing to the country. And as I said, in this election, I think America is tired of that. We want a stronger dad. We want a stronger authority figure. And as I wrote in my piece for Parade, that I think Americans might appreciate him more when he's gone. Just the fundamental decency of the nurturing dads, whether it's Hayes or Truman or Obama. When Truman left in 1952, his popularity was like at 22%. And everyone thought he got a lot of the same criticism as Obama, that he doesn't stand up strongly enough. He's trying to help everyone get along. But David McCullough wrote that biography 25 years ago, and there's just the sense that Truman is now considered just a very decent man, and we really appreciate him. And I think some of the same is going to be felt about Obama by generations who have no recollection of him actually being in the White House. All right, I just want to show you a few pictures. So here's FDR with his eldest son. So his children are always holding him up. And that was the nature of the relationship, that, as I said, he nurtured the country and his children kind of nurtured him. And here's FDR with his eldest daughter, eldest child, Anna, one daughter. And again, the relationship of parenting, of children in history. I did a piece for Politico talking about Anna and her effect on history. Anna may well have kept FDR alive for an extra year or so. She was living in the White House, and FDR's doctors had no idea how serious his heart condition was. And Anna, noticed how frail he was and was on top of his health condition. And at Yalta, she is very watching over him like a hawk to make sure that he can attend to business. So again, these children, these relationships are really critical to American history. Here's, this is Chip, Carter when he was younger. I think that's at the Democrat, running in '76, and then the one I showed you of Amy Carter, the one child everyone remembers, and her three brothers. Here's Franklin Pierce, and Franklin Pierce was very handsome. He was a great speaker, and there was so much hope when he gets elected. He's the last Democrat to win a majority of the vote until Woodrow in 1912. He's a very promising figure, and he's just totally crushed by the loss of his son Benny, and he's just never the same. And here's Calvin Coolidge Jr. This is the boy who dies in 1924, and so Coolidge had two sons, John and Cal Jr., and Cal Jr. is lionized as a national hero. He was just a really sweet kid, and he was all over the papers during Coolidge's second term. Here's that austere tiger dad, John Quincy Adams. He looks the part. And here's George Washington Adams, and this is the saddest story in the book. George Washington Adams buckles under at Harvard under the pressure of the tiger dad. He's the eldest son, and his name is George Washington. So John Quincy is basically saying, presidency or failure. He does very well at Harvard. He wins a big literary prize, besting Ralph Waldo Emerson. So he's promising. But then he starts drinking. He has an affair with an Irish mistress and there's a child. And when Adams is leaving here in Washington in 1829, he writes to George and says, "Come to Washington from Boston. Please come and help me move." And George is terrified that his father is going to go back to Boston and see what a mess he's made of his life, find out about his illegitimate child, and he kills himself en route. He jumps off a ship, and he's about 28. That's just the saddest. And this is the tiger dad. He's either make or break, and this would be this. Maybe it was a genetic condition. I don't want to say it's his fault or anything, but just that the toughness, can be really overwhelming for the children. But again, another of his sons, Charles Francis Adams, does very well and is presidential timber. But this is really the saddest. But in general, as I've written for Smithsonian Magazine and a couple of other places, in general, the first children, until the current crop, the Bush girls are doing well and Chelsea Clinton's doing well, but in the 19th century, they used to talk about the curse of the presidential child, that because these men were all so driven and they really didn't put a lot of time into their families, and they loved their kids, but they had to play, the family was second fiddle, and a lot of the kids suffered, and sometimes it's just bad luck, like the Benny Pierce being killed. Franklin Pierce was actually a very sensitive dad, but it was just bad luck that Benny died. But this sense that the first children were cursed. All right, here is John Eisenhower, and this is an amazing story. John Eisenhower is with his mother, and he graduates from the West Point on June 6th, 1944. And that's where my chapter starts. And right after that graduation, he goes to visit his father in Europe. And his father, is a nervous wreck because of D-Day, and he's sort of watching, what's going to happen here. Are we going to win the war, or is this a disaster? So there's a month-long father-son bonding. And Eisenhower, again, is a tiger dad, and he's criticizing John's bridge game, and he's criticizing John for his uniform is dirty. They take a Jeep ride, and John's uniform gets dusty, and Ike criticizes him, and he was very tough. John actually, again, the tiger dad can make or break. John actually does very well. He just died a couple of years ago. He was the eldest presidential child. He dies at about 90. But he became a biographer, a military historian, and wrote a couple of bestsellers and sort of found his niche as a writer. And here's the playful, this is a letter of Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt's writing to Alice, and he writes these playful letters. And again, the effect on history, Teddy Roosevelt wins the Nobel Prize in 1905, and one of the reasons he wins the Nobel Prize is he sends Alice, his charming daughter, to Asia on a mission, and she schmoozes with Asian leaders, and again, she really helps him. He negotiates the end to the Russian-Japanese War, but again, his child is helping him in his career. And so I wrote a piece for Politico about the Trump children and Chelsea Clinton, is that we elect not only a president, we really elect a family. So maybe we should just check out, what the children, because they're probably, especially now when presidents or candidates are older, their children are going to, be around and maybe involved in some kind of shuttle diplomacy, just as Alice was in 1905. And here's Grover Cleveland. Both he and Tyler, another reason why I believe the claims that they were double-dealing dads is both Cleveland and Tyler marry much younger women, and they have a kind of history of being playboys. And here's Cleveland with his much younger wife. She was about 30 years younger. And here's John Tyler, and then here's a picture of one of the children, slave children of John Tyler, who the Tyler picture unfortunately is very small, but the facial features are quite similar, and that's some of the evidence that, I don't know if he fathered all 52, but that there, so Jefferson, the Jefferson and his slave children, that was all sort of just rumor, and then people started to believe it, and then there's some DNA evidence there, and I think historians now are taking the Tyler allegations much more seriously, and there isn't DNA proof yet, but it sounds as though there's something there, and I talk about that in the chapter. So I think I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Yes.
Was very disappointed in the man that she chose.
Exactly.
To marry, and then she went abroad with him.
Yes.
Can you fill in the details?
Yes, it's a very. So the question is about Ulysses S. Grant and his daughter, and his daughter Nellie Grant gets married, and there's such a touching scene. She marries this Brit, and Grant is terrified because she's going to move to England, and the day of the wedding, Grant goes into a room in the White House and just starts crying. Again, he's really sweet. And this is a guy who's a general and kills a lot of people, but he's also got this very tender side. And the husband is horrible and cheats on her, and her life is just very, very sad. But her wedding was the social event of the 19th century, and it was a huge, and Walt Whitman wrote a poem about it, and it was, everyone had such high hopes, but Grant was heartbroken about losing his daughter to England, and it turned out that his fears were well grounded. Yes?
Mark Russell once told a joke. He said, Thomas Jefferson's slaves used to refer to him by a term of endearment, Daddy. Did you find anything to support or refute that? Because I know there's a lot of controversy.
So the question is about Thomas Jefferson and his slave children. Annette Gordon Reed, the Harvard historian, has written a couple of books about that. One of them won a Pulitzer Prize, so I've kind of stayed away. But there is some DNA evidence that he had 6 children with Sally Hemings, and that his wife dies around 1782, and that he has a long-term relationship with Sally Hemings, and that he eventually frees Sally and the children when he dies. Yep.
I don't think you mentioned Lincoln. Is he in multiple categories?
Yes, Lincoln, it's a great question. There have been 10,000 Lincoln biographies, so I decided to stay away. But Lincoln, I think he comes up in a couple of categories. I stick him in grieving dads. And also and in the piece I wrote for the New York Times about Biden, I talk a little bit about this, because Willie dies in 1862 when he's about 11, and Pierce immediately writes Lincoln a letter and says, "I know what you're going through." And Willie was the child. Lincoln had 4 children, was the one to whom he was closest. He talks about Willie as his like other half, or very, very intense relationship. And Lincoln, and some of the Lincoln biographers argue that this loss kind of hardened him, and that was just around the time, the winter of 1862, when he really steps up the Civil War, and it's sort of like Willie's gone, and it's going to be okay to, I really have to do this, and we really have to step up the war effort. So that's a way in which, again, this loss, again, may be related to national policy. Not always, but that's a theory. But I just wrote a piece for Politico that about first children who went to Harvard. Malia has chosen Harvard. She is the 23rd first child. Harvard, Yale, and comes in a distant second at 7. And the reason I mention that is Robert Lincoln, his eldest son, went to Harvard. And there's a letter that the Harvard president sends to Lincoln in 1862, where he says, "Your kid is failing chemistry. He needs a talking to." And Lincoln was a preoccupied dad with Robert. So with Willie, he was kind of a playful dad, because Willie's at the White House, so he can spend more time with him. But Robert, he didn't see much, and Robert once says that during Lincoln's presidency, he never spoke to him more than 10 minutes because he was so busy. And Robert also at Harvard gets punished for smoking in Harvard Square. He's kind of he's acting out a little bit and was constantly getting into trouble. But he does graduate from Harvard, and he goes to Harvard Law School, but then he doesn't finish, and Lincoln appoints him as Grant's assistant. And again, Robert has like a Zelig-like role in Appomattox. He's at Grant's side when Grant meets with Lee in April of 1865. So that's another way in which these presidential children kind of pop up in major moments in American history. Yep.
Did David Eisenhower, if my memory serves, did he marry Julie?
Yeah, David Eisenhower is John's son. John had, and I didn't speak with David, I spoke with a couple of his siblings. Ike was also a Tiger grandfather. David writes a memoir about Ike, and David is about 16 in the early 60s, and he's working for Eisenhower at his farm in Pennsylvania, and Eisenhower finds out that he's taking a long lunch break, and he fires him, the Tiger granddad. But then he rehires him the next day, and he says, "Let's go play some golf and make up." But again, Eisenhower was a toughie.
Was there any other crisscrossing of presidential families?
In terms of marriages, yeah, I can't think of any off the top of my head. But yeah, he marries Nixon's daughter, Julie. And Nixon was kind of a preoccupied dad. He would sleep in the Senate office building. when he was a senator, and even when he was in the White House, he would often have dinner alone. He was a workaholic, and again, that's one of the reasons he became president. Other questions?
Well, Josh, thank you very much. Join me in giving Josh a round of applause. Josh is, as you can tell, an avid researcher, and when he digs, and he remembers, and he's very prolific. Your books have come out about once every 2 years once you got started.
Yep.
You're going to tell us what the next one is going to be?
I'm not sure. I think I'm going to dive into presidential families again. I'm not sure exactly.
Well, you've certainly got background for that right now.
I spent a lot of time in those.
You should go on a quiz show as well.
Yeah.
I know which categories you could pick.
Yeah.
But we're going to have a book signing, and if you'd like to talk more with Josh and buy a book at a Library of Congress discount and get it signed, now is the time. The book signing will be right over here. We also have, as you go out, a list of other talks coming up in our Books and Beyond series, which is scheduled pretty much through the rest of the year. And you'll find that it's a nice variety of both books really directly related to the Library of Congress, or in a way to other research libraries. And we're not against promoting other libraries either. We like to show the connections that are needed. And I know that Josh, for example, did archival collections in several of the presidential libraries, and then, of course, a lot of the secondary source material, which is overwhelming, was used in some of the rest of the family things. So you did a great research job as well. So a final round of applause for Josh, and meet him over there. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.